yours. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring to you Adam Abdelmoula, the Humanitarian Coordinator for Somalia.
Thank you, Farhan. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, thank you very much for this opportunity to brief you on the humanitarian situation in Somalia. Today, the humanitarian community in Somalia launched the 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan, HRP, and the plan outlines our strategy to provide life-saving and life-sustaining humanitarian assistance and protection to 5.5 million most vulnerable Somali women, men, and children. The country is facing one of the most complex humanitarian crises in the world. In 2022, about 7.7 million people will require life-saving humanitarian and protection assistance, and that is almost half of the Somali population. Moreover, 71% of the population will continue to live below the poverty line, especially in areas where humanitarian access remains a challenge. This year, 2021, the humanitarian crisis has been aggravated by floods and droughts. In April, more than 80% of the country was facing a severe drought situation. When the April to June rainy season started, rains were below the normal average and did not alleviate the drought conditions. Instead, they triggered severe flooding that affected 400,000 people. As we speak, the humanitarian crisis in Somalia has worsened considerably and will likely deteriorate further. Usually, Somalia should be receiving the November to December rains now. Instead, widespread drought has devastated the country. Over 3.2 million people are currently experiencing the cumulative effects of 3 consecutive below average rainy seasons. And at least 169,000 people have been forced into internal displacement and are in search of food, water, and pasture. With the next rainy season also expected to be below average, Somalia is facing the longest consecutive poor rainy seasons in decades. Livestock diseases are widespread. Prices of basic commodities like water, food, fuel, and livestock fodder have spiked. And media reports indicate that several people, including children, have died of drought-related causes. Across the country, severe water shortages and lack of adequate sanitation and hygiene facilities have heightened the risk of disease outbreaks, especially in internal displacement camps and in conflict-affected areas. People are increasingly forced to resort to drinking untreated water from hand-dug shallow wells, increasing public health risks. Cases of acute watery diarrhea and cholera, as well as measles outbreaks, are spiking in multiple drought-affected locations. This is happening in a context where the most vulnerable Somalis have faced decades of protracted conflict, food shortages, climate shocks, disease outbreaks, the desert locust infestation, and in more recent times, the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. And many have not yet recovered from the droughts of 2010-11 and 2016-17. Despite climate-related shocks, Somalia is largely a protection crisis. Conflict and insecurity have aggravated vulnerabilities and displacement. In 2021, some 777,000 people were forced to flee their homes between January and mid-December. Conflict and insecurity also result in protection challenges, including physical attacks and threats to life, arbitrary arrest and detention, kidnappings, early marriages, sexual assault, and child recruitment. Humanitarian access is hampered by ongoing hostilities and movement and security restrictions. With 2.9 million people estimated to be internally displaced throughout the country, Somalia has one of the highest numbers of IDPs in the world. Moreover, 2.2 million of these IDPs require urgent humanitarian assistance, as most live in informal sites, often at the danger of evictions by landowners. Half of the internally displaced people are women and girls who faced and continue to face heightened risks of sexual violence and harassment and abuse. This year, humanitarian partners in Somalia have been able to provide different forms of assistance to around 3 million Somalis. To respond to the drought, the UN has recently released 17 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund, the CERF, bringing the total CERF funding for Somalia to 52 million this year. This is in addition to 60 million allocated from the Somalia Humanitarian Fund in 2021. It is critical that the humanitarian assistance is scaled up in Somalia. If we do not scale up, 3.8 million people, including those affected by drought, will face acute food insecurity through January of 2022, rising to 4.6 million people by May. And of these, 1.2 million children under the age of 5 are likely to be acutely malnourished in 2022. And among them, nearly 300,000 children are projected to be severely malnourished and at risk of dying without immediate treatment. These are not just numbers, as you know, but people. So the HRP, which we launched today, is an inclusively prepared strategy to assist the most vulnerable people in Somalia. And we must find the required resources of about 1.46 billion US dollars to implement this HRP to save lives. The world cannot afford to ignore Somalia. And inaction on our part will mean many lives lost. And let me just conclude by saying that we are aware of the fact that the world's attention is shifting away from Somalia to newly raging crisis, whether it's Tigray or Afghanistan. And just let me remind you, members of the press, that when the world's attention shifted away from Somalia in the past, many horrible things happened here. Mass migration, piracy, and the emergence of Al-Shabaab. Not to mention the potential that this time Somalia's crisis could spill over in an already troubled sub-region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdelmoula. So let's turn to the floor for questions. First, let's go over to the people in the room. I can't quite see. Are there any hands up there? If you can scan the camera over the room. Yes, Evelyn. Please, can't hear you. Please use your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yes. Now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the briefing. Is there a bigger danger from the attack by militia, or is it the natural disasters, drought, and so forth? What is the biggest danger right now?
Well, it's hard to quantify which one is a bigger danger because one is man-made, the other one is natural. All I can say at the moment is that 80% of the Somali territory is gripped by this severe drought, which has a potential to kill and displace more people, as opposed to an asymmetrical warfare that is waged by an armed group and whose tactics continue to change from time to time. So in terms of numbers, climate shocks have the tendency to produce more suffering and more casualties than a terrorist organization. But you never know. In one terrorist incident in Mogadishu, just a couple of years, 3 years ago, there were over 600 casualties in one day. And if you tally that together with all the casualties inflicted in that year across the country, it could be many thousands. So it's hard to tell. And then the comparison itself is difficult to make.
I'll turn over to Abdelmoula.
Thank you, Mr. Abdelmoula. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. And I have two questions. First, how do you see the spillover of the conflict in Ethiopia over the humanitarian situation in Somalia? That's my first question. And my second, how is the situation in Hargeisa and the northern part? Is it also as bad as the south? Your mandate is, I think, covers all of Somalia. So how is the situation in the north? Thank you.
On the possible implications of the Ethiopia crisis on Somalia, we are closely monitoring the situation in Ethiopia, as it has the tendency to affect Somalia in three critical areas. Politically, given the connectivity between the two countries, both at the leadership level and the communities they share. The second is security, as Ethiopia is one of the troop contributors to Somalia and also has some troops deployed here on bilateral basis. And the third is the humanitarian. So in all of those fronts, we have contingency plans in place. For example, in the humanitarian arena, we are looking at several factors here, including the arrival of Ethiopian refugees into Somalia, possible Ethiopian migrants crossing the Somali territory in the hopes of finding their way to the Arabian Peninsula, and so on and so forth. So we have contingency plans in place. During our last humanitarian country team meeting, I asked all the UN humanitarian agencies to repurpose and reposition their stocks in anticipation that we might see some influx of populations from Ethiopia coming towards Somalia. Now, UNHCR, as a lead agency on these matters, has declared a level 1 emergency, which is just preparedness and putting together all the plans. And that's underway. If these worst case scenarios materialize, we anticipate that most of the influx will be towards Somaliland because of the proximity and also because of the relative security in that area. When it comes to the humanitarian situation related to the drought that is gripping the country, some parts of Somaliland are just as affected as other parts of the country. So when we talk about 80% of the Somali territory, we are talking about Somalia in its totality. And we are not excluding Somaliland from that scope. So areas in southern and some northern parts of Somaliland are just as hard hit by this wave of drought as other parts of Somalia.
Are there any other questions? Anyone can take the floor. Raise your hand if you have anything else. Okay, I see no one else on the floor, so I would like once again to thank Adam Abdelmoula, the Humanitarian Coordinator for Somalia. Thanks very much, and good luck with all of your efforts.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thanks very